Marnin!
Madden!
Welcome to the India Explained podcast, recorded in London and San Francisco. One take, unscripted, no rehearsal. Hey Bunty, good morning. Greetings from San Francisco. I believe you are in Paris as a tourist at this point of time.
That is correct, Rohit. There's a half term in the UK. That means schools are shut for about a week. So, me and my wife and daughter have come to Paris for a few days, about 5 days. So, today is the second day that we are here. It's a beautiful city. And yes, we are tourists here. So, really having fun. It's a really enjoyable place. Seen I've got a bit of the family who've married into a French side. So went to see them. So it was really good. How are things with you?
Oh, marvelous. That sounds wonderful. Things are very good. It's winter here. It rains in winter in San Francisco. We've had some gorgeous days, and which is good on on an individual basis, I suppose. But again, there's some worry about California going into drought again. But otherwise, all good out here. I thought that since you're in Paris, Our Man in Paris, by the way, I should just say is one of my favorite jazz albums. Associatively, I just thought of that. But anyway, while we are on tourism, I thought we could talk about this story that you sent me a link to earlier this week. There's a Goa minister, Vijay Sardesai. He's the Goa Town and Country Planning Minister, and he cautioned against North Indians who he claimed want to create a Haryana in Goa. And he says domestic tourists are scum of the earth. I'll turn it over to you. I have a few thoughts about this specifically in the Goa context because at some point of time my family was in Goa and I used to visit very often. I was in boarding school then. So, but let me just ask you, what do you think of that comment right off the bat?
Well, I think North Indian like South Indian is a very bad, bigoted term, so I'll stay away from that. Okay. If the comment is that there's a certain amount of lumpen tourism, which is basically young men from very patriarchal bits of the country in motorbikes, roving around in groups of in packs of 10, 20, harassing, either women travelers or women in groups, drinking irresponsibly. Is that what he's calling out by proxy? I think in which case he's making a fair comment. Now, whether that is open to all domestic tourism, because there are lots of, families who go out to Goa, have a nice time and come back without any dramas. But if he's speaking to kind of tourism where, what I call the Sunny Deol brand of tourism, which is one man, Ash Karne, with like 4 of his friends or 20 of his friends on a motorbike gang. That's the kind of imagery this draws up, is my understanding. Is that your understanding, Rohit?
In a matter of speaking, yes. So I'll make a couple of points here. The first is, the article itself is used these terms, which, I can just imagine in the US, if an argument was made with terms that are so loaded in terms of identity politics, there'd be like a furor. He said that, he wants the government to attract foreign and quote unquote upper class Indian tourists. And I've put the word upper class in quotes, right? But I think in India, for instance, I noticed that people just use terms like, we want high class, top class. We don't want low class people. These very, very problematic classifications of people, they use kind of like routinely. So there is definitely, this kind of class bias here. And then there's this larger question about the fact that, the entire country is something that belongs to all citizens of India and they have the right to be there. So what's troubling to me is I think the notion that people from North India are lower class, whether you're talking literally in terms of class or you're making a generalization about behavior, as you pointed out. So that's one side of it. Now, I think there is a general domestic tourist culture, which has some aspects that are troubling. And in places like Goa, it has manifested itself in a number of ways. It was a long time ago, over 20 years ago, almost 25 years, more than 25 years ago, I want to say, my family was based in Goa and I was in high school then and I was in Delhi. I used to come back and spend some time for my vacations there. And Goa was, much emptier, much more pristine in many ways at that point of time. But even then, there'd be a few things that would happen. One, every year without fail, there would be a spate of drownings because you'd have guys from, Bihar and UP, usually gangs of young men or groups of young men. They had no idea about currents or anything. I don't know if they'd be drinking alcohol or not. And they would just jump into the water and you'd hear this, these tragedies. The second thing is that there's a number of beaches which were, beaches where people would bathe, would sunbathe, in the Buff, and some of them were topless beaches, and even some other beaches you would often find, men and women in either in the nude entirely or women topless. So what would happen is, you'd have these guys kind of gravitating towards those women or just ogling at them. And in one case, I remember seeing an incident where, it was, almost 35 degrees, number of people, Indians and foreigners, lying on the beach. And there were a couple of guys, definitely from North India, wearing suits and, trying to take photographs. And there was an incident where the guy, I don't know which country he was from, he had seen that these guys had taken some photos of his partner or the women in the group they were part of. And he actually, took the camera and he took the reel out and had it exposed. And, I've had this experience kind of, firsthand too, that with my family, my wife and I and, my in-laws, we had made a trip to Goa, and I don't know whether the hotel was the Ramada or some other hotel, just for a couple of days. And my brother was also with us, and we were a large group. There was a bunch of guys who had come from, I think, now these were not North Indians. These were guys from, I think, Bombay, and they were just, ogling at every single woman out there. They'd in a group they'd go up to one woman or another. It was really irritating. And I was on the verge of confronting them, but they somehow have this down to this slimy art that they'll do it in a way where, that they're like almost hounding you, but just at the right point when you might just ask them what's up, they'll kind of move away. Turned out that the next morning they were out, because the previous night there had been a party at the hotel by the pool, and these guys had, some of these guys had, I think, misbehaved or gotten drunk, and the hotel staff had ejected them. So there is this core aspect of truth beneath the bigotry as far as this piece is concerned.
Well, look, I don't want to look. Obviously, those kind of incidents are very unfortunate, and it's good to call them out and realize this. But the idea, India lacks a stag tourism circuit. Right. So when a group, and I'm not going to try and defend this, but when a group of young men who are feeling high spirited it happens in the European circuit, there's a range of Eastern European cities and Spanish cities where people go to club, get drunk, get hammered. And the behavior in these places is par for course for both men and women to behave irresponsibly, drunk, and, what people say, what, young people do. Right. Now, the thing is, in India, the public culture is such that it is okay for men to behave in a particular way, but women aren't allowed to do that. Right. So it's an odd one, Rohit, because I'm trying to think that if you go to a clubbing town like Ibiza in Europe, or go to Prague, which is a stag night capital, or is becoming a stag night capital, this kind of behavior of group of men getting drunk and misbehaving is actually par for course, and there's a tourism market for it. But I guess that Goa is not ready for it, because Goa, by and large, is a family destination. And the most benign interpretation of this guy's comments would be, I'd like to welcome families. I'd like to welcome people who spend more money. I don't want to welcome people who misbehave with other people and cause trouble. That's the most generous interpretation I can offer.
Right.
But obviously, I don't think this kind of behavior is good. And the broader point that you make about tourism in India, whether it's like dribbling on the walls of Taj Mahal or Ajanta Ellora, those kind of tapuri panchis, where, people will and Manu loves Sonu, all over the Taj Mahal. That thing has probably diminished. It's also because, our sites of historical value or cultural value have for a long time not been party to any kind of protection or scrutiny. You just have a little sign saying don't spit, don't smoke, but that's about it. Whereas, the idea of behaving irresponsibly around the Colosseum is that you can't find. I mean, obviously there'll be some guy who will scribble it, but it's a complicated one. I don't think you can point blank say that everybody from one part of the country it misbehaves, because I don't think that's true.
Right.
But I think there is something in there where young men in groups traveling together, and also lots of sales conferences. This kind of people getting rewarded by staying in a hotel by the beach as a kind of reward for something, and that clash of people who haven't holidayed with families, because that's the other thing. The culture of holiday, because in the Indian scheme of things, holidays means going to a wedding or staying with relatives. So it's again a family to family exchange. Now, as the country changes and the economic circumstances changes, going for holidays, you run into a set of behavioral issues which probably people haven't had to deal with before. And I can talk about some of the other things that I've noticed here in Paris and other parts of Europe, where there's this problem of Middle Eastern tourists, right? Particularly guys from, you can tell they're from Jeddah, Oman, Muscat, those kind of countries, where they are not used to seeing women in public space behave in a particular way, and they just completely go wild. So, but that's something completely different.
Yeah. Well, excellent point. And I'll just respond briefly to a few points you made. One, you're absolutely right that I don't think we can make these kind of generalizations at large, because this young man problem is is something that's not restricted to North India. I mean, I've seen it in places like Uti as well, right? And it's not as if Indian states, the South Indian states have some kind of perfect record of, women's rights and so on. A second point though is this, creating a kind of culture where, you can party or let off steam or whatever. In India, the closest rough equivalent of that culture is, harassing women has kind of been normalized within that. Now, I will point out that, even in Ibiza or other places, there's this whole question of, whether that's really there is gender parity there. And, are those spaces that are entirely and completely safe for women, or do we see, violence against women in those spaces too? So again, the fact that while there are, there are distinct problems in the Indian context, some of these issues may be more universal as well. And yes, I would actually say that this idea of desecrating public spaces is I don't think we're entirely out of the woods there. But someone had made a very interesting remark. I forget who, which is it's not a defense of desecrating a step well. I'd been to Nimrana many years ago, and there's a beautiful well there which goes down 300 feet or something, and every single step had numerous messages. So. But what this person had said, I think I don't know if it's a historian or a journalist, is that this that there's a sense in which we don't fetishize these objects as heritage objects, but that's also because they've been part of everyday life and history for centuries, and it's maybe worth considering who do they belong to. Are these for the purpose of middle-class Indian tourists, or are these to places that are to be accessed by everyone? Now, of course, there is a very strong case for preserving heritage, and nobody wants spit and graffiti all over them. So just a few kind of off-the-cuff remarks about that.
So I think let's do something, because I think a couple of other things to talk about is the historical place that tourism abroad has in the Indian mind. And also the idea of, how different cultures behave as tourists. And I'm happy to talk about the Chinese people. I'm happy to talk about the Middle East. So I think if you are up for it, let's come back to it for a part 2. But talking this time about tourism in other parts of the world and behaviors that we've observed in our travels.
Sure. That sounds perfect. And maybe we can share a couple of anecdotes about a few other Indian peculiarities which don't quite have to do with, desecration or ogling at tourists and so on. All right. Okay, Manti.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening to us. Rohit and Bunty would like to sign off. Please stay tuned. Follow us on India Explained on Twitter. Keep listening. Thank you for all your support.